Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the newly released Open Seas online adventure game Skull and Bones, and see how it stacks up both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the now decade-old spiritual predecessor Assassin's Creed Black Flag. For this analysis, both games are being played on a PC, with the graphics settings cranked up as high as possible at a native 4K resolution. However, certain post-processing effects like motion blur will be disabled, along with Nvidia's PhysX effects that are not properly supported on newer hardware. So, let's kick this comparison off by first discussing the character models. Now, I think it's important to understand here that while there are some pretty clear similarities between Skull and Bones and Black Flag, the purpose of either game is very different. Skull and Bones is first and foremost an online multiplayer naval combat game, putting a much heavier emphasis on its ship-to-ship combat. Knowing that, you'd expect Black Flag's many character models to be more detailed and impressive. Though we're also talking about two games separated by roughly a decade. While character models in Ubisoft games aren't necessarily groundbreaking, they've absolutely seen some significant improvements since the early days of the PS4. So even with this very basic, player-generated character model, we're seeing things that are a big step up technically from the old Edward Kenway model. The geometry is more sophisticated, texture quality is much higher, and the way light interacts with these textured surfaces is much more realistic. Even in cinematics, the way various character models move and speak is a level above what we had back in 2014, giving more life and personality to the various story characters players will meet throughout their journey. I don't necessarily feel that the characters in Skull and Bones are written any better than those in Black Flag, but they certainly convey more emotion during their cutscenes. Though that's where the praise here ends for the characters, as Skull and Bones' mute protagonists feel remarkably dated relative to the time released. Movement and general traversal animations are abysmal, making every step on land an absolute chore, and the camera distance and default FOV even made me feel nauseous at times. I feel Skull and Bones would benefit more from eliminating the on-foot bits altogether, as nearly every action players need to take on land can easily be accomplished with a menu system. Though, I can understand the desire to keep these bits in, as they are intended to immerse players more into the world, with lots of NPCs cheering the player on at port, along with various NPC vendors that are much more unique and interesting than the randomly generated NPCs used as vendors in Black Flag. Speaking of which, due to the difference in game style, it's important to note that AC Black Flag makes use of the series' signature crowd systems in a few of its environments, with groups of characters walking around aimlessly in the streets, and sometimes being scripted to work on various projects around town. That type of dynamicism is not at all present in Skull and Bones, as the majority of NPCs are stuck in place like animatronics at set port areas, and serve more as vendors than anything else. On the bright side, Skull and Bones features much larger crew sizes on board the player's ship. In Black Flag, a part of the experience is growing your crew throughout the game world either by recruiting members at local pubs or freeing them from British soldiers. It's a cool metagame that plays directly into the action, as having a larger crew has a direct impact on the ship-to-ship combat. However, the actual visible size of the crew doesn't seem to change all too much, with only a handful of men on deck at any one time. Skull and Bones ups the crew size a great deal, loading it up with mostly unique and very diverse NPCs that seem to have a few more unique animations as well. You don't get to expand this crew yourself, and they don't have any advanced logic like jumping across to other ships during boarding, but the overall density of NPCs on screen is no doubt scaled up here. Then of course, there's the ship itself. Assassin's Creed Black Flag is mostly limited to a singular ship, the Jackdaw, a custom brig with optional upgrades that can expand its defense and combat capabilities. Other ships throughout the game are either limited to certain missions or serve as enemies out in the open sea, ranging from small sloops to massive man-of-wars. The ship itself is beautifully detailed, with things like ropes, riggings, flags, and a series of climbable surfaces taking full advantage of Assassin's Creed's signature parkour system. Skull and Bones, on the other hand, gives players a bit more variety in what they can sail. The game proper begins with a tiny dhow, which is functionally similar to the harpoon boat in Black Flag. but as players gain infamy and resources, they can begin building larger ships, each with their own unique capabilities like better top speed, increased defense, ramming damage, or weapon slots. One of the largest ships currently available to players is the Brigantine, that is more or less the same style of ship used in Black Flag. When comparing the two side by side, the differences, aside from the cosmetic designs, are negligible. Those rounded bits along the mast and steering wheel that now have a higher poly count. Textures appear a bit sharper, and there's some minor differences in the ship's overall design and cosmetics. That being said, the Jackdaw is arguably more impressive than any of the ships in Skull and Bones because you can actually let go of the wheel and freely explore it walking along on the deck. This comes into play even more during combat, where players can literally board an enemy ship after dealing enough damage, triggering a cool optional objective where players need to defeat enemy crew members in direct combat. Skull and Bones, on the other hand, limits boarding to a very brief cinematic, triggered after manually firing hooks from the ship's side cannons. One could argue that this cuts down on the tedium of having to jump back and forth between ships every time there's a boarding event, though it's certainly a less immersive experience as a result. But what I did find most interesting about the ships in either game is how they sail. I was genuinely surprised to see how poorly the sailing in Black Flag had aged all these years. The Jackdaw typically sails in a straight line, with very minimal heel or roll because of wind pressure on the sails. Wind itself plays only a minor role in traversal, as it can help boost the player's speed if angled properly, but is otherwise not as detrimental. Skull and Bones, on the other hand, while functionally similar, does try to incorporate wind a bit more. Wind direction is a crucial component for traversing the sea, and tacking is key to traveling against the wind, especially when chasing targets. Visually, you can see the ship heeling at greater angles, and the character model will even throw up their hands when traveling directly against the wind, encouraging the player to change course. It's still not quite as expansive as the sailing in other games, but when stacked up against just Black Flag, the design of the ships themselves, along with how they handle, does feel like a bit of a step up. Moving on, let's talk about the environments. While Black Flag and Skull and Bones may look very similar when sailing on the open seas, both games do take place in drastically different environments. Black Flag takes place in and around the West Indies during the early 18th century. Players sail around Cuba, Jamaica, Florida, and Mexico, and are treated to the beautiful sights and sounds of the Caribbean, with its blue water, tropical beaches, and its diverse vegetation and wildlife. In staying true to the Assassin's Creed format, players can also disembark from their ship and traverse large, densely populated cities, including Havana, Nassau, and Kingston, all three of which require a separate brief loading screen when docking, effectively separating them from the main open world. The open sea itself is one impressively large and fully connected area, with over 50 islands that players can sail directly to, without any loading screens or obvious transitions. It feels great, and even for today's standards, it's an impressive feature that contributes greatly to the experience. What's more, most of the land masses in the game are gorgeously detailed, with dynamic vegetation that the player can hide in and push out of the way, lots of NPCs, activities, and era-appropriate decor. The many larger land masses that are inaccessible on foot aren't quite as impressive though, with a lot of flat, repetitive vegetation assets that lack the proper shadowing to give them realistic depth. But considering the average view distance of these assets, it's not too problematic. This is where Skull and Bones has a slight advantage, as its game world feels more consistent as a result of this, with more depth and detail to each landmass. It takes place around Madagascar and the East Indies, and therefore features a very different type of pirate environment, with lots of large French and Dutch fortifications sprinkled around local tribes, outposts, and secret pirate societies. Like Black Flag, the larger towns will require players to dock their ship and effectively load into a separate area from the main open-world environment. These larger towns are not nearly as big as those featured in Black Flag, as they're designed purely around speaking to vendors for player progression. There are some cool details here and there, but the ports are obviously no substitute for the wide-reaching cities of Havana or Kingston. Skull and Bones also features several smaller beach areas called outposts that players can explore on foot, either to speak to unique vendors or to hunt for treasure using found treasure maps. Though, unlike the islands in Black Flag, these too are not seamless, with a brief loading screen to transition onto the beach from the ship. However, it is worth noting that these areas are still technically within the same open world, as things like player ships sailing by are clearly visible. Meanwhile, the details within these outpost locations are okay, but nothing necessarily amazing either. There's lots of decor like barrels, crates, skeletons, and even some dynamic vegetation, but it all feels very artificial, with simple pathing around a small beach, and doesn't feel nearly as believable as the seemingly random islands in Black Flag. The lighting in Skull and Bones has seen some decent upgrades over the older lighting methods used to illuminate the worlds of Black Flag. Back in 2014, Black Flag's base lighting design revolved around using a single key light for the sun, and then baking in what are called irradiance probes to simulate indirect light. This, coupled with things like screen space, temporal ambient occlusion, and multiple dynamic atmospheric effects, helped to create the warm, tropical island locales of Black Flag's world, with bright, vibrant green palm trees contrasting nicely with the rich blue ocean. For all intents and purposes, it works quite well, and the dynamic lighting effects still hold up, creating beautifully cinematic sequences that transition within seconds depending on the weather. Though, it's a bit stale by today's standards too. Light rays are present but feel uneven and pixelated when viewed at certain angles. Volumetrics are limited, and the colors, while vibrant, aren't accompanied by the appropriate levels of ambient occlusion necessary to provide actual depth to the image. Skull and Bones offers slightly more sophisticated lighting techniques, with appropriate levels of bloom, more realistic light interaction with surfaces, superior volumetrics, and more effective shadowing to accompany it all. Light rays, for example, are represented more cleanly, with no visible artifacting along edges like in Black Flag. The old dirty lens effect used in Black Flag has also been scrapped here, a technique that was popular for many games during that time, but has since been phased out. And the smoother dynamic lighting transitions, screen space reflections, and global illumination all contribute to a much more vibrant and lively picture. Skull and Bones even makes use of ray-traced global illumination too, though the improvements are negligible in this case, and only really seem to impact the look of the on-foot areas like the main docks. Though the bulk of the game cruising around on the open sea looks great in the lighting department, and does this particular setting justice. Then, of course, we can't talk about these two games without talking about the effects, mainly the water simulation. This was probably one of the most surprising improvements in Skull and Bones, as I've long held that Black Flag's wave simulation was among the best. Though, upon booting it up all these years later, I was underwhelmed by just how flat and lifeless Black Flag's water simulation actually is. The rolling sea looks so tame and formulaic by comparison, with the more intricate ripples and surface textures not drawing in from very far away. Up close, especially when viewing the water from the side of a stationary ship, the simulation looks a lot better, and is impressive, even by today's standards. Though Skull and Bones has certainly improved on this simulation quite a bit, incorporating more complex textured surfaces for the water, along with more varied wave movements. Even the splash effects and the way that the player's ship will drop down into the water and interact with it feels more believable. Smaller details, like the water that will occasionally splash up onto the ship's deck and wash back off, looks better too, as it always looked a little flat and unrealistic before. Even when you're on shore, you'll notice some more sophisticated wave simulations, with this series of white particles helping to simulate the white foam of the water crashing against the sand. Again, I don't feel Skull and Bones' wave simulation overall is anything to necessarily write home about. It's fine for what it is, and is a clear improvement over similar waves used in a 10-year-old Assassin's Creed game. As far as the other effects go, I think it's safe to say that Skull and Bones does make some notable improvements here too. Fire and explosive alpha effects look impressive, though the smoke effects in Black Flag do a much better job of capturing the aftermath of firing multiple cannons at the same time. Weather effects also feel more realistic, with distant storms being clearly visible on the horizon, as opposed to Black Flag that saw the game's color grading and fog levels suddenly change at times. And the reworked rain particles, sound effects, and changes to wave simulation make these storms more intense than similar effects used prior as well. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which of these two titles do you feel has the better audio quality and design?
Ship coming after us, sir! Schooner! Spaniards! Just the lone ship, Captain!
I think we've lost them, sir.
Awaiting orders, sir!
Fire! Cannon ready! Say the word to that flight grapple, sir! Fire!
Look, Captain, the whole place shot down!
They're no match for us!
Fire! Full exposed! Take the shot, sir! Fire!
Brace yourselves, people! Someone now! Ah! The depths will sparkle with your blood!
Fire now!
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Skull and Bones is technically the better looking game, with superior lighting, object models, environmental complexity, and effects. The water simulation in particular looks great, and ship-to-ship combat is much better for it. However, when it comes to the overall immersiveness, there's no question that Assassin's Creed Black Flag offers a much more compelling pirate experience here. The story is more engaging, the on-foot controls are significantly better, and being able to swing across from one ship to the next seamlessly, or dive into the crystal clear blue waters of the Caribbean to find treasure, makes Black Flag the better pirate game of the two. Skull and Bones, at the very least, is a great cooperative experience that offers hours of gameplay, decently deep economy systems, and lots of customization. I especially like the more lighthearted and supernatural elements here, as there's more freedom to really expand on the live service model with things like new monsters and huge events that probably wouldn't make sense in the more grounded world of Assassin's Creed. But as it stands, Skull and Bones doesn't offer as much as I had hoped, and for its asking price, it's unlikely to attract the audience it needs to sustain itself currently. But what do you guys think? Are you interested in picking up Skull and Bones, or do you still prefer Black Flag? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.